Welcome to the Grow My Salon Business podcast, where we focus on the business side of hairdressing. I'm your host, Anthony Whitaker, and I'll be talking to thought leaders in the hairdressing industry, discussing insightful, provocative, and inspiring ideas that matter. So get ready to learn, get ready to be challenged, get ready to be inspired, and most importantly, get ready to grow your salon business. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Grow My Salon Business podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Whitaker, and it's great to have you here with us today. And I do have a little favour to ask of you, and that is that you rate and review us on the Apple Podcast app. By doing that, it helps other people to find us, and it also motivates us to keep producing great content for you. So all you need to do is go to the Apple Podcast app, search Grow My Salon Business, scroll to the bottom of the page, select ratings and reviews, and write us a review, and we would be very appreciative. So with that said, let's get on with today's show. Alcohol and drug addiction are a fact of life for many people, and in the creative industries, perhaps it's more prevalent and widespread than others. Now, for some people, having a drink 2 or 3 times a week does absolutely no harm at all, but for others, it's the beginning of spiraling out of control. Now, my guest on today's podcast is a very good friend of mine, Clive Allwright, who has recently started a podcast that he calls Straight Edge. So in today's podcast, we are going to discuss addiction in all its forms, whether it's alcohol, drugs, gambling, food, sex, or just being addicted to your mobile phone. We're also going to talk about the path to sobriety and helping those around you that have a problem, what to say and do, and perhaps what not to say and do, and so much more. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Clive.
Thank you, Anthony. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here. As you know, I'm a great fan of the podcast. So to ask me on to talk about this, which is definitely different to what we usually talk about, I'm not going to lie. I'm a little bit nervous, but it's an honour to be here. So thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure to have you on. So let's just start off with a brief overview. You have actually been on the podcast before a long time ago. I'm sure you remember it, but a lot of our audience probably haven't listened to it. And it was way back in the beginning of the podcast, so probably about 200 odd episodes ago. So let's just start off with a quick overview for people who don't know who you are. Who is Clive Allwright? Give us your sort of 1 or 2 minute backstory.
Sure. So I'm 54 years of age. I currently live in Sydney, Australia. I've been here for many years. I've got a salon in Sydney in an area called Potts Point, but I've been in the hairdressing industry since I was 16. I was very fortunate to start my career with Tony and Guy when they started off with 2 salons in London. I worked in the Mayfair salon, and I've been in and around education my whole life. I've lived in Hong Kong. I spent many years living in LA. And then I ended up in Australia, and I've been very blessed to have a great career that's taken me all around the world and met some incredible people. So education is what I'm very passionate about. But on a day-to-day basis, I run a salon with a team, with my business partner, and do what 99% of every other hairdresser does, and that's just work with our clients, and I do a lot of education as well. So yeah, quite busy, and it's been an amazing career.
Great. Okay. Now, last time we talked a lot about, your business and your background and another project that you have, Pillaroo, which we're not going to talk about today, but for anyone who is interested in finding out more about that, then I'll put the link to the first episode that we did in the show notes for today, so people can find out more about what you're up to and follow you on social media. But sure. As I said in the intro, today we're going to talk about Straight Edge, which is a podcast that you've started with a partner of yours who is Amie Morris. But I want to just jump straight in and start talking about that. Why did you start a podcast, Straight Edge, and what's it all about?
It's a great question. Why did I out myself to the industry that I had struggles with alcohol and drugs? It was a big decision to make. But what happened is I've been sober now for 4.5 years, and I got asked to be a contributor to an industry magazine here in Australia called Hairbiz. And they said, can you talk about the future of the industry? And what I actually wanted to speak about was I'd been sober for a couple of years at this stage. And I said, I think there's a bigger picture that I'd love to talk about. And I wrote an article called Coming Clean About Sobriety. Now, it was no secret to the Australian hairdressing industry that, I did like to have a drink and I live life to the full. And when my life changed, I wrote about a lot of the challenges that I faced and also having that open conversation with people that I just don't drink anymore. And so once the article was published, I got this overwhelming response on social media. And I think it was in excess of 400 private messages after the article had gone out of support and how people had, many hairdressers had got family members or staff members that had also suffered with the same thing. And Louise May, who was also on the podcast with us, who's the editor-in-chief of Mocha Group and the Hair Biz magazine, said, this is a big conversation. And I think we should, if you're comfortable, you can maybe do more with it. So, it took a little time to go. It was a slow burn. And then I met Amie, who was one of our clients, who was a producer. And I mentioned to her, we were out one day and I bumped into her and I wasn't drinking. And we had this conversation and she said, Clive, you should do a podcast and talk about this because I think it's quite prevalent in the media industry. It's very prevalent, obviously, in the hairdressing, barbering industry as well. And I know many people that have suffered, not just with alcohol and drugs, but all different, as you mentioned in your intro. It's been a journey.
Okay. Now, I want to just sort of tell our listeners that at this point in time, Straight Edge has probably done only 4 or 5 episodes. I think I've listened to the first 3. I know you might have a couple of others that are in the can that haven't been released yet, but I highly recommend that if you're listening to this, that you go and check out the first episode, well, that you check out all of them. But if you want to find out about Clive's journey, he talks about that in episode 1. Episode 1 is basically Clive's, drug and alcohol addiction, journey. And I said to Clive at the beginning of this, before we started recording, I didn't just want to repeat his episode because I want you to go and listen to it because it's a great story and it's something that I think a lot of hairdressers will connect with and they will relate to. So I'll make sure I put a link in today's show notes for a Straight Edge podcast and start with episode 1. Now you mentioned Amie. Amie is your sort of partner in crime on the podcast, from what I gather, and Amie's not a hairdresser, but she is in the creative industry. And she's sort of very much involved in the production side as well as your co-host. And I've listened to episode 2, and I think I'm right in saying that episode 2 is basically Amie's story, isn't it? Like of a young woman and her challenges with drugs, alcohol, food, whatever. So, there's so much in there, I think, that if you're in this industry that you will find people and stories that you can relate to. I think that your story and Amie's story, it's sort of set out right from the beginning that this isn't just about hair and beauty industry, but it is about the creative industries in general. Is there something about people like us, people that are more on the creative side as opposed to the academic side, that makes them more inclined to have problems with addiction, with drugs, alcohol, food, whatever? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is there anything
Sure.
that you think from your research and people you've spoken to that would draw that conclusion?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I need to point out that alcohol, any addiction doesn't have any boundaries either. It doesn't matter what background you come from your family group or where you grew up. It doesn't matter how much money or little money you have. Addiction it crosses all boundaries and affects so many people's lives. So the thing is that I can relate to is that many hairdressers and barbers, a lot of, if they're like me, we didn't really succeed at school. Academia wasn't really one of our strong points. And so when it came to leaving school, we were, okay, what do we do? And I was one of those percentage of hairdressers that I never grew up wanting to be a hairdresser. It was just something that I fell into by chance. It's not like something that I grew up and thought, right, that's what I want to do. Circumstances arose where an opportunity came up for me to work at this amazing salon in Mayfair. And I took that job not knowing what I wanted to do. And I found myself with a creative tribe that showed me a side of life that I never knew existed. Like, I was very fortunate to work with a big global brand to start off with. And as they grew, I grew. And a lot of the people I worked with were rock stars. You know, they were doing lots of education and traveling around and doing things on stage. And it just it showed me a side of hairdressing. And I think when you talk to a lot of hairdressers, you know, we're such creative people. And with that, like with artists, musicians, a lot of the time that involves some kind of substance you think it enhances your creativity, is what I'm trying to say. And it actually doesn't. I now know that, but there's been many a times where I was putting shows together and I'd be drinking and, you know, listening to music and writing down notes and planning bits and pieces and getting all creative. And the next day I'd wake up and it was just a page of scribble, you know, and couldn't decipher really what I'd written. So there's definitely an underlying thing. And when I spoke to Amie, you know, and I explained my situation, she said, Clive, it's rife in the media industry. It's rife in any industry, the banking industry. And so we've tailored this podcast to reach an audience that I connect with and that Amie connects with and Louise connects with. And that is, you know, the hairdressing, barbering, media industry, where, you know, it is quite prevalent. And so we feel like we've got a good message to talk about. And, you know, we're not the poster people of recovery, but I think by sharing our stories, they say you hear a lot when you're in recovery, and the opposite to addiction is connection. And when I first got sober, I listened to loads of podcasts from all over the world. And one of the things that was very prevalent in my recovery was when people were telling their stories that were so raw. Because I think when you are in it, and I need to point it out, you don't have to be on a park bench to be addicted to anything. I mean, I was a high functioning person that ran a business, was married, and on the surface, it all looked fantastic. But there was deep down, I wasn't coping, and I was using alcohol and drugs to a degree to cope. I got to a point where I just knew, well, I didn't know any different. It was a way that I coped. When I finished work, when I finished a show, whatever happened, I could celebrate or commiserate, it involved having a drink. And so when I listened to a lot of podcasts at the beginning, one of the things that really have impacted me was listening to people's raw stories, because I thought I was unique. I remember thinking to myself, I can't be addicted to alcohol because I can go 4 or 5 days without it. You know, I heard these people share their stories and I thought to myself, wow, that's me. Like, I didn't think that anyone else had a life like me. And I thought, I'm not like the people you see in the park. I've got a business and I'm, you know, hanging on to my marriage at the time. And it was borderline because things had got so out of control. And when I heard people talk on a podcast and share these brutally honest stories, and I was like, wow, I did that. And that was what I did. I just realized that I had a connection with people, and it's definitely something in our industry that we don't talk about a lot. When we've had 12 clients in a day, or how many clients we do, and we've had a busy day, we've listened to so many people's stories. Some are really incredibly amazing and inspiring, and some of them are terribly tragic. 9 times out of 10, we'll finish work as a group and go, let's go next door to the bar, let's have a drink. And that's the way you cope. And so with the pathway that I've been on for the last 4.5 years, I thought I need to have this conversation with as many people within the industry as possible, because as I say in my first episode, if I'd have heard my story when I was 19, maybe my decisions would have been slightly different, because I really was on a mouse wheel. It was a merry-go-round, and I didn't know how to change. And until things really got to my personal rock bottom. And then what's happened since then has been an amazing journey. And I think when you do get to see another side of life, you want to shout it from the rooftops to such. Maybe I shout a little bit too much, but yeah, I think it's definitely been a positive thing in my life, for my business, for my marriage, and for my personal growth as such, because I was drowning.
Yeah. Well, when you just use the term rock bottom, what was your sort of ground zero? Was there a moment Was there a day, was there an event where you thought this is it? I mean, some people have a moment, do you know what I mean? Whether it's they
Sure.
wake up in hospital or they wake up in prison or whatever it is. Was there a moment for
Yeah.
you?
There was many. There was hundreds. And they were progressive. As I said, addiction and recovery is progressive. And I woke up like most people thousands of times going, I'll never drink again. And I've now learned on this journey that, what happens with your mind is that it no longer remembers pleasure or pain to a degree. You remember the time, but you don't remember how you felt. So 3 days later, after I've, recovered from my hangover and someone says, do you want a drink? I would go again. And it would be a sort of 2 or 3 days a week where I would be constantly, I'd either be thinking about it, doing it, or recovering from it. And it just escalated slowly throughout my life until 2019. There was a big hairdressing event in Australia called Hair Expo. And I think it was in the last time it was in that format. And we'd launched the Pillaroo site at the time, and we were doing a lot of meeting and greeting with people. And there was a lot of parties on in the evening. And I was just burning it at both ends. I mean, I was really hitting it hard. I was having to, I'm sure many hairdressers can relate to doing a show and doing an awards night and then having to, God forbid, if you win something, you've got to go on the telly the next day or whatever it is. You've got to get out of bed in the morning and go in front and talk to people. Well, mine was sort of 5 or 6 days of hitting that really hard. And, I knew I was in trouble. My health had really deteriorated. I was 113 kilos. My doctor for 2 years prior had told me you're in a crossroads in your life. If you don't change your lifestyle, this is going to probably end very soon. Your cirrhosis of the liver, your kidneys are excreting protein. I developed type 2 diabetes. And he said, all of this is lifestyle, Clive. And you need to, or not need to, but you should. And I advise you to change. Otherwise, you're heading for a heart attack, and it's probably going to be soon. And I just put it in the too hard basket. And I thought, I know what I'm doing. I can do this. And then during the course of that event, I went to an event on the Saturday night, and I was broken. And it was about 8 o'clock at night. And I just was on that revolving door. And I felt dreadful. I was sleep deprived. I was sort of shaking with, sleep deprivation, anxiety, you name it. And I was at the time under the influence of, cocaine and alcohol. And someone came up to me at the event, and they asked me if I was okay. And I said, not for the first time, but I admitted it. And I was like, I'm really broken here, and I need to stop. And they calmly put their hand on my shoulder and then said, look, if you really want to get, and you're serious, then contact me. And I knew that they were sober. And I kept going until the Tuesday. The awards was on the Monday night, and I kept going until the Tuesday morning. And I was in such a world of pain, like the anxiety. I had to lock the front door, pull the blinds, which I'd done thousands of times before, but this was to me my rock bottom. And I quite often talk about it in recovery, that if you're old enough like us to see Chariots of Fire, I felt like mentally I crossed that finish line with my hands up, and I knew that if I didn't change, then I was probably going to die. And that was what it took for me to ask for help. So that was my rock bottom. But I say there was thousands of those sort of tremors, as such, if I could refer to it as, before the real earthquake really hit me, and then thankfully I've not had a drink or taken any illegal substances since. And so I see the world very differently now. And I need to add that, within 4 years, I've reversed the diabetes. My liver is at optimum level. I do a lot of exercise. I do a lot of swimming, and, I'm down to 82 kilos. And my doctor sat back in the chair and he said, Clive, he said, I don't know what investments you've made in your private life. He said, but you've made the biggest investment in your life, in your health. And he said, he said, you're the second person that I've seen in my doctor's surgery that's actually done this. He said, there was another young man who was in a very similar state to you, but a lot younger. And he said to reverse, I mean, the diabetes will always be there dormant, but it's just, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's like I eat healthy. And that's the thing. When you're drinking so much, you make bad choices when it comes to food, and you're too hungover to exercise, and everything in your life starts slipping away. And mine had just crept up and crept up. And, living in the US, and traveling like I did I had big, I used to eat a lot of rubbish. There's so many great things to eat in America. It was fabulous. I'd go to the LAX and I couldn't go past Cinnabon, without having one on the way in and one on the way out. And, and then stop at the bar on the way through and then drink on the plane. It was just what I did. And so, yeah, my life is very different now.
Yeah, I'm not being insensitive for anyone who's listening to this, because this is what we're here to talk about. But you mentioned alcohol. You also mentioned cocaine. Which was the bigger problem for you? Was it drugs or alcohol?
Well, it was definitely the alcohol. So the alcohol was just something that I did, and I mentioned it on my on my episode about growing up in the UK. That's where all of the communication happened, where we, as I said, we were celebrating or commiserating. We did it in the pub. I also need to point out as well, in the 80s, when I was working in London, there was no social media. When I worked for Tony and Guy, we'd go to the pubs in central London, and Sassoons would be in there. That's where we discussed all of the shows that we were doing and all that kind of stuff. So drinking was a big part of it. And then as I started to drink more, then drugs got introduced in the 90s, the party drugs to start off with. And then that sort of ran its course, because in the 90s was pretty hectic with the whole music scene going on. And that was at the time the house music thing. And it just progressed into then cocaine got introduced, because as you got drunk, the cocaine leveled me out. And I could continue to drink, and then I could continue to hold a conversation, and then I could drink more. I was never, a user to the point where they call it dry sniffing, where you don't even have an alcohol drink. You just go straight to the cocaine. That was never me. Mine was always, and I was a sesh head. What I used to do was I'd go on the weekends. I'd get to the weekend and I'd think, and I'd say to myself, oh my God, I've worked really hard. I'm going out to drink. And I would have a drink, but then it became to the point where I couldn't stop. And I would drink when I'd stop at the bottle shop or the liquor store or whatever. And then I would drink when I got home. And yeah, it was a problem. And then, the drugs leveled the alcohol out. So they were both involved. And then it's just going through that whole process of hating yourself. And then you'd wake up the next day and go, I can't believe I've done it again. And then you'd eat rubbish. And it was this constant battle that I had, and not knowing why I couldn't stop. And then, since I've got sober, I've had to really deconstruct my life and unpack it and find out what was behind it and what made me do it, and or why I didn't stop. I mean, it's a big thing to go out and tell your friends that you don't want to drink anymore. There's a lot of shame. There's a big stigma about that. Yeah. And I was thinking about it earlier on when I was driving back home, and I was thinking about coming on this podcast, and I was actually got quite nervous because, I mean, even though I'm doing my own podcast, you've got such a global audience, and I'm like, I have that massive insecurity of like, whoa, this is going out throughout the whole world, and do I really feel comfortable about doing that? When it reminded me of that same time when I felt like I was going to turn up in the pub and go, I'm not drinking today. I didn't know how to do life without alcohol. I didn't know how to, it scared me. I didn't know what am I going to do for fun? Those of people that hung out with me, majority of the time, they would see the fun side of Clive. I'd be buying the drinks, I'd be laughing and joking. There was a definite dark side to that as well when I got home, and, everyone would go home and go to bed, and I'd just keep going. And my wife said to me, I mean, she deserves a medal for putting up with me, but, she said, sitting back and watching you kill yourself is really awful. You know what I mean? It's just, it was horrible, and it was consistent. And, I'd go for periods of time and then it'd just keep going.
On your podcast, I know you mentioned the word intervention, and you've just spoken about your wife, and the hairdressing industry is a very social industry, and you're often not doing this by yourself, and there are other people that are around you that had the opportunity to, and maybe they do. That's what I'm asking you about. Interventions. How does that look? How did that work for you? Did people try and sit you down and say, Clive, you've got a problem, and how did you respond? Like, what's that side of things like for you? Tell us about that.
Good question. I need to point out as well that you can't force anyone into getting sober. It needs to come from within. Actually dealing with someone at the moment that, their family have reached out to me knowing what I've been through, and they're like, how can we help? We're watching this person and they're gonna die if they don't stop. And it's that brutal honesty of like, I'm really sorry, but unless they actually reach out and they say they want to stop or they want to get out, you can forcibly put them in, well, you can't actually, but rehab. If you ring a rehab and say to someone, I've got a friend here that I'm really concerned about, I think they're going to die, most rehabs will say until they pick up the phone and speak to us, then we can't really talk to you because it's got to be their decision. And that certainly happened with me. Like my friend, I've got a core memory of my friends meeting me one night in the bar, and I got there and there was this strange guy that was really ripped and really fit. And I thought at first he was, coming to beat me up, but they said, Clive, sit down. And they said, we've really noticed that your weight is so bad and, you're drinking all the time and you're a funny guy. We love you, but we're really concerned that you're going to die. And this guy here is a personal trainer, and we're offering to pay for him for you to do some sessions with him because and I just looked at him and I was like, are you having a laugh? Like, I thought we were coming for a good time. Like, and I just went, see you later, goodbye. And I walked out of there, and when I look back on that now, and that's really awful, it's quite horrible. But there, interventions you can see, and I think I talk about this on the podcast. If there's a series right now on Netflix called Painkiller about the oxycodone in America, and if you think that it's a choice sometimes that you can see families destroyed, you can lose your kids, you can lose your family, you can end up just being, and yet people are incapable of stopping. They've got to really want to make that change, and nothing you can do. You can mask it for a little while. You can take them out of the scenario. And that's one of the things I talk about on my episode was I used to do these geographicals. I would work for a while in one country and then I go, right, on the surface, it looked like a great career move. And it was a brilliant career move. I had a great career, but deep down, it was like, it gives me a chance to clean the slate here, and I can go and I can make a new circle of friends. And yeah, the intervention thing is a tough one because it is horrible to sit back and watch a family member or loved one go on that pathway and you're powerless until they actually reach out and ask for your help. And then that process can begin. But a lot of us will say, no, I'm fine.
Do you recommend that people try and do that, or is that a bad idea?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think
to instigate an intervention. So better than sitting there doing nothing. At least you've made some attempt to help them. Yeah. Whether they meet you halfway or not. It might even just be that you open the door a little bit. It's a crack in the door for them to at least start considering and reflecting. Even though, like you did, you just turned and walked out, it maybe started that process of you thinking, actually, maybe I do have a problem. I don't want to admit it, but do you know where I'm coming from?
I do 100%. And when I lived in LA, one of my good friends actually was the first person I knew that went to AA. And he said to me, Clive, I think you should come with me. And I went for a couple of meetings. I think I went for maybe a month. And I now realize that was 20 years ago. And I thought, no, I'm okay. I've got this. This is not for me right now. And we're still friends, and he's 25 years sober now. It took me a long time to stop, like a long time. But I think you can show someone love and kindness. And and it's funny because we had a drug and alcohol counsellor come on that we recorded it this week. That's in an upcoming episode. And he spoke about if you're in a relationship with someone and they have a problem, then you shouldn't enable it. In other words, don't drink around them if they're trying to stop drinking. Don't take drugs around them, and be supportive. Don't put people in that scenario of where they're going to really struggle. And, I've seen and heard there's a lot of braver people than me in recovery that you hear some, horrible stories where the children have pleaded with them to stop and they were still incapable, I'm saying, of stopping. Yeah. So you've got that, planting that seed. I think the thing that happened with me, with my friend in the States, was he planted a seed for me and I knew it was there. And I just was in denial for the next 20 years until I went, I can't do this anymore. I've got to stop. So,
yeah, I've written down something. I just want you to comment on it. And I wrote down life and soul of the party.
Yep.
And then I did an arrow and I wrote drink and drugs. And then I did another arrow back to life and soul of the party, meaning that it's this sort of circle. You're a funny guy. You're a great, entertainer. You're the sort of, people like you. People are drawn to you. You've got a good personality. You're larger than life. What comes first? Is it the life and soul of the party that then has to get, drunk and stoned, which reinforces the fact that they're the life and soul of the party? Or is it that you have to get drunk and stoned in order to be the life and soul of the party? I don't know if I've made a hash of that statement or not, but
sure.
I just want you to comment on that as to how that sort of, one thing reinforces the other.
That's a good question, because I think, if I'm very honest with you, this whole thing started off way before I even tried alcohol. This was one of those things when I was a child growing up that you wanted to fit in. I was really short when I was growing up. I'm still not that tall now. But, growing up in England in the 70s, I had this masking to be around people, and it's hysterical. You might even pick up on it. I mean, we've known each other for a long time. Put me in a room with people with an accent and all of a sudden I'll start talking like them. And it's just on a default mechanism because I just want to, and it's like a chameleon, because like my business partner's from Rochdale in England. And if I talk to her and I talk like that after a while, and it's this whole thing about fitting in. And when I started going out, there was so many insecurities growing up, and I've always had that. I guess now the modern term for it is imposter syndrome. I've had an amazing career and like, wow, how did I get here kind of thing? And with that comes an incredible amount of anxiety, like the paralyzing anxiety. I've worked with some incredibly talented hairdressers over the years. I mean, going up on stage, I used to work with Nick Irwin for years, and I used to be physically sick before I walked up onto the stage before a big show. And he used to pep talk me, and he'd go, Clive, you're great. Get up there and believe in yourself. And, then I had mentors of mine that we'd have a whiskey before we went on stage to calm the nerves. And it was the only way I knew to do it. And then afterwards, you'd have that endorphin rush. That's, that serotonin. Your brain would be going crazy because I was relieved it was finished. And this was an example of a hair show, but this was on a daily life. And then I'd go to the pub and we'd celebrate, and I would keep going because I didn't want that high to end. And then once I'd experienced that, then that was what I was chasing all the time. It was that adrenaline, that anxiety. When you've got anxiety, what better thing? I hear it all the time in recovery, especially with women in their 30s. They talk about when they're 14, the boys on the sea, they've got anxiety. They go to a party, they drink alcohol, and all of a sudden it gives them courage. They can talk to people. They're the life and soul of the party. There's a pattern that goes on with so many of us in life that all of a sudden you just become the life and soul of the party, But with me, it wasn't for the fact that I wanted to be funny. It was the way that I just managed to get through life, because I'm funny anyway, but then put alcohol in me and then I can get really funny and really stupid and sometimes obnoxious. And I can get, it's like flipping a switch, it's like, which personality am I going to be? And sometimes it was, it was challenging. A lot of time it was challenging.
Let me ask you this. There'll be a lot of people listening to this that are salon owners. And I've been in this situation where you've got staff members who are a lot younger than you. Sometimes a lot younger, they're 20-year-old or even 18, 19. And, you've got a bit of you have a responsibility. I mean, you're their boss, but you're also a human being that is able to connect with them maybe on another level that perhaps their parents or friends can't. Maybe there's a different level of respect, I suppose. So what I'm asking you is that if you're a salon owner and you're listening to this and you've got staff members or staff member that has a serious problem with drugs, alcohol, what should you do or shouldn't you do?
That's a good question, because as a salon owner, we're not just salon owners, are we? We are financial advisors. We are therapists to our staff. We're constantly, everyone's got challenges. I believe we've all got some kind of addictiveness in it. Each one of us has got some kind of a addictive nature as such. And whatever it is that you need to do to, whether it be sit on the toilet and scroll through your TikTok or whatever it is to take your mind off of stuff, we've all got stuff going on. We're all results driven, and we're, in the salon. But it's interesting because the drug and alcohol counsellor that we had on the show, he mentioned about what I said to him, what can we do with staff? And he said, sit people down, have a great conversation before you start. I mean, I know with your coaching business, with that communication, we talk about retail, we talk about, hitting commissions and bits and pieces. And I think there's probably this is a good time to then talk about people's health and well-being and how are they coping as well with what's going on in your life. I remember clearly when doing one of your courses and talking about what happens around the corner if someone gets sick or you have a car accident and all these things. And I remember listening to it in the course and thinking, good God, what happens if that happens to me? But there's so many other factors that can come in as well. You can have a staff member that just goes missing for 3 or 4 days, and then they're too scared to come back and they run. And then you realize that they're just in a world of pain. And I think with anything, as I say, again, the opposite to addiction is connection. And if you've got somebody that's understanding of what's going on. When I first got clean and sober, I saw on an industry Facebook page someone talking about how they discovered their 16-year-old apprentice. She was at a party and she had a bong, and she put a thing on going, I've seen this on Facebook. How should I deal with it? She's obviously taking drugs or smoking drugs. What should we do? And then I read the comments underneath, and it was really quite awful. It was like, maybe call the police. What you should do is dinner, and you should fire her today. You should do this. And I read it and I'm like, what would you do if that was your daughter? How would you tackle it then? Right? How would you approach this if it was, would you sit her down and say, look, I saw what you did on Facebook. I've seen that you've been smoking marijuana or whatever it may be, but I'm coming from a place of kindness, and, what you do in your private life is completely up to you. But if you need help with something, is a much better way than just go, well, I've discovered this and we're going to take you out the game.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about a salon owner that I know who used to think it was a great idea at Christmas time to get all the team in a limousine and drive around the city and do lines of coke in the back of the limousine. And obviously that's just crazy at every level, because in that limousine, you've got all your team in there. Like, I suppose what I'm saying to you is this: what you do as an adult is entirely up to you. But as a salon owner, you have a responsibility, and often you're employing young apprentices, young staff members that are so impressionable that they just want to be like you, and they're 17, 18, 19, 20, whatever. And when you demonstrate that as being normal behavior, aspirational behavior, that is so irresponsible at every level. And yeah, I mean, it just is. It's crazy, isn't it? I suppose I just want to say that you have a responsibility, and as a boss, as an employer, as a human being, you have a responsibility, I think, to reach out and try and help other people. But I also think, and you've already touched on this, and I remember I said this in one of my books that I wrote, that you have to know when to cut them loose.
Correct.
Because you can't save people from themselves. So when they're stealing from you, when they're taking product and selling it, when they're taking money from the till, whatever it is that they're doing, there's a point where you try and help people, but there's also a point where you have to, it's like what you said about the intervention, people and people ringing up a rehab center. They can't do anything until that person goes, I've got a problem, I need help, and they make that phone call or whatever. So as an employer, I suppose, just as a way to finish that, it's like you have a responsibility as a human being to try and help people. So A, set the right example, and B, if you see someone going off the tracks, do the right thing and take them out and say, listen, we need to have a talk, and I can hook you up with someone to help you.
It's the same with a family member. So if you see someone with a family member, it's a bit like if they take money from the till and all that kind of stuff, you can lead them down the path and go, we're here to help you, but there's a cutoff point, right? And you've got to say, well, I can't help you anymore. This is just enabling you to continue living in this house or whatever, or drinking. Then it's time for you to leave. And then that's when they're going to hit their rock bottom. But you can't, we have a saying, you've got to put your oxygen mask on first before you help someone else. And you've got to make sure that you are really, and so,
I was going to say that you've sort of come at this already from different angles. And again, it's one of my questions. It isn't really a question. It's a sort of I just want to see what you've got to say about this. And it's the role that social media plays. Podcasts are, to whatever degree, part of social media. They're not the same as Instagram and Facebook and whatever, but I'm going to group podcast as being a component of social media as well. And it's interesting how different generations are so open to exposing themselves on social media. Exposing themselves is probably the wrong word. Different generations are open to, telling all on social media. And so interestingly, you said, before you came on today's podcast, you thought, actually, am I really up for doing this? Because I know that, Anthony's got a big audience and they're going to listen to this. Is that really what I want to do? And as I said before we even started recording, you can say what you want or not what you want, and we can edit out whatever you don't want to say. So I never put anyone under any pressure. But it just, it fascinates me how, and you've done it again on this podcast, you've bared your soul, you've been very open and honest and transparent, and you've done that even more so on your own podcast, gone into a lot more detail about it. And I know why you're doing it, because I hope I'm not putting the words in your mouth. You genuinely want to help other people, that if your experience can serve to help other people, you don't mind embarrassing, or whatever the words are, yourself by saying, this is who I am and this is what I've done. And I've had other people on the podcast who've done that as well. And so I'm just sort of wondering how much of that is part of the process of recovery. How much of that is an important step about being open and honest and saying to the people, listen, I've done all this. Is that part of recovery?
100%. Embracing the old part of me is very important. We've all got, especially when you're drinking or whatever, you've all got those things in your past where you're not proud of as such. Like drinking was a big thing of mine, and it's easy to ignore that and just go on and just go, okay, well, I've changed now. Well, the only way you're going to get change is unfortunately to go back and look at, and I don't want to use the word like where the bodies are buried as such, but like I've used that as there's skeletons in the past. And instead of ignoring that, then what I do is I go back and I and I basically hug them and say, you are all part of this story together. And I can't move on unless I'm free from what the addiction that I had. And it was a mindset with me. It was the old Clive. It was almost like I had to put Clive, the life and soul of the party that was really just a very fake person, into being, okay, well, I'm going to be very honest now, and I have a lot of gratitude, and with that comes acceptance. With that becomes a lot of emotion, and I drowned all those things out with alcohol. And emotion can kill people, and it's a powerful thing. And I wanted to go forward with lots of self-awareness, and realize that there was a pattern that I needed to break. And to enable to break that pattern, I needed to be very real and transparent. There's a thing, I'm in a 12-step program for both drugs and alcohol. And by doing that, the steps of that program, I have to go back and make a list of all the things that I've done wrong. And I have to, try and make amends where possible if I don't hurt without hurting someone. Like with my wife, for instance, I need to sit down and say, when I did this, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize that, whatever. But you know what I mean? It's the process of going through to make sure that I need to be free of that. And when you're doing that, when you're drinking like I was, you're spinning plates on lots of things. And when you stop and you take that anxiety away, you have that opportunity to really discover who you are and be a better person, and and take responsibility and accountability of your life, really.
What's the hardest thing about sobriety?
There's lots of hard things, but there's a lot of good things as well. Like life is always going to be complicated, and life's always going to throw you a curveball. One of the things that I often say to myself, I haven't given anything up. I've got everything back. And there's definitely a thing. I've got a guy coming on the podcast tomorrow. I'm really excited to talk to him about, and it came up recently in a conversation, and there's a lot of things you've got to learn to do again sober. Sex is one of them. It's like sober sex. So many people are like, someone mentioned to me the other day, I'm just going on the dating scene at the moment. And, I don't know if I've ever had sex on a date when I've been sober. And so the guy I've got talking tomorrow is, there's a lot of things out there you've got to do. You've really got to, there's lots of firsts, right? So there's your first birthday that you're sober. There's your first Christmas. There's your first Friday. There's all these firsts that you get. You get your first Saturday night where you haven't had a drink. And then with that, like, how do I go to a Christmas party? And this is the thing where a lot of people struggling with addiction, they go, oh, well, I'll just drink, but I'm going to drink on my birthday. And then I've got so-and-so's wedding coming up, so I'll have to have a drink then. And understanding, when you dig deeper into this addiction pattern, then you go, well, you don't actually need any of that. You hear a lot of good things on various different podcasts. And, one of the things that I loved hearing was someone said, it's Sober Dave, his name is, got a podcast out of England. And he said, if you went to a fish restaurant and you got that ill the next day, the way you got from a hangover, because you would go, I'm never going back there again. I'm never, like, that restaurant was terrible. And yet within 3 days, you're like, oh, I'm going to go back. It wasn't the food, it was the company that I was with. And you go back and you get sick again. And it's the pattern. And that's what, you've got to learn a whole new way to live. And sobriety has given me everything that drugs and alcohol promised me. And that's the statement that I live by, really, because I really do believe that. I believe that all of that party time and the drugs and alcohol were giving me everything I wanted, and it took away more than it gave me. And I say, I have to remind myself now, I go, I've got everything I need, not everything I want. And that's okay, because I've now got a clear mind to work with it. I can go, right, let's focus. I mean, that's one of the things about being in the 12-step program is that you do learn a new way to live, and you're surrounded by like-minded people and it's not the only route you can take to do what you want to do. There's many different routes. That's just the one that I chose. But yeah, that's what we're doing on the podcast, is getting people to come on and tell their story.
How much of it, that inward searching for meaning and who you are and dealing with, your past, how much of that is a spiritual experience? I'm very conscious they're saying spiritual as opposed to religious. It can be both, I'm sure, but I'm curious. Because sometimes I'll talk to people who, from what I gather, I don't actually know much about the 12-step program at all. But for some people, they find God for them going through that sort of process. Other people never talk about it from that religious sort of aspect. So I'm just asking you that. How much of that is it a spiritual experience for you, if that's the right word?
Oh, yeah, it's a deep one. That's the big thing that scares a lot of people off to stop, to get into a program, is that G word, right? And it is definitely a higher power. But I need to backtrack a little bit. My mum died suddenly when I was 18, which was a big part of my struggle with trauma. And I've gone through my whole life as an atheist, going, there isn't a God, because I don't believe in there's one, because at the time when I was 18, my life stopped turning, and I just couldn't comprehend that if there was someone up there, then that was pretty cruel. And so I've not been a religious person at all. However, during my program, during my journey of recovery, I've definitely got a higher power. I mentioned in my podcast, I do a lot of ocean swimming. I go out there. I put myself in vulnerable situations now for me. And something got me to stop drinking. I didn't keep going and die. Something got me to see, I now look at the rest of my life as an adventure. And I'm going to be honest with you, that higher power or spirit guide or whatever is something that's really been introduced in my life in recent times. And as I say, it's definitely it's a higher power. Do I get on my knees in the morning and actually do a pray? Yes, I actually do. Right. And I've never admitted that to anyone on this podcast. Right. But I do. And I thank my higher power for the fact that I'm still alive. I actually talk to my mum in the morning. I talk to a few people that I know in this industry that are no longer with us. And I actually believe that, I have got a connection to something. Now, I didn't think those words would have come out of my mouth 5 years ago. And there's no way. But I believe that there's, sidetracking here. My daughter was on a plane recently. She's 12 years old. She was coming back from Brisbane, and my wife, we sent her unaccompanied. She went to see her friend. The shortened version is there was such massive high winds in Sydney when we were going to pick her up from the airport. It's 9:00 on a Saturday night, and a lot of the flights were being redirected to Melbourne. We had not paid for my daughter to go unaccompanied. She was just a passenger because she was getting picked up at either end. And then it dawned on us that if the flight gets redirected to Melbourne, she's 12 years old, it's going to be midnight, and what on earth is she going to do, and where's she going to stay? I got to that airport and I went in the bathroom. I didn't tell my wife, and I actually prayed. I said, please make this plane come down safely and land in Sydney. And on the way back out, and we were driving, my daughter landed safely. She actually slept through the whole landing, throughout the whole line. When she came out, oblivious to the whole thing, I was completely relieved to see her. And I was like, oh my God, he's heard me, right? And then we're in the car, and I looked over at my wife and I went, I've got to tell you something. When I was in that airport, I actually went in the bathroom and I prayed that this was going to happen, because it was the last flight in. There was no more flights. She was going either back to Brisbane or Melbourne. And my wife looked at me and she said, well, when you get home, make sure you ring him back and thank him. Right? That's a conversation. That's the conversation that would never have happened in my marriage, right? I would have gone, no, we're okay. In fact, I would have been waiting at the bar, nervous, drinking, waiting for that plane to land. And so there's definitely a part of that in my life that wasn't there before. And I'm kind of grateful that it is.
Yeah. Good. Look, I could go on, but I'm not going to go on. And I think that's a really nice place to finish up. Where can people connect with you on Instagram or other social media channels, tell them the name of your podcast again. I will put all of this in the show notes so people can find it. But over to you.
Sure. I mean, it's called Straight Edge, the podcast. We have a website, and connect with us on Instagram, Straight Edge, the podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. And if anyone's out there that's got a similar story, I mean, if I can add, I remember when I first got sober, I listened to David Bronsky and Philip Santos' story, the guys from New Jersey, and how they met on the podcast. And they said, we met in NA. And I was only about 8 months to a year clean, sober at that time. And I was like, wow, there's other hairdressers out there that are just like me. And so if anyone is interested on becoming on as a guest, we'd send us a message on Instagram at Straight Edge, the podcast is the best way to get us. That will go through to Amie. And we'd love to chat to you. It's new. It's only just, we're finding our feet. It's growing. We're getting some more intelligent people on the podcast that can explain more about addiction. It's a learning curve for me as well of how this all works, because it's everyone's different. So I've certainly been enjoying the journey. I've been learning a lot. I can't thank you enough for getting me on and as a guest and talking about this, Anthony. It's definitely something that's new to me, but I think it's equally as important. So thank you, mate.
Yeah, no, look, I will put those links on our website, growmysalonbusiness.com, and in the show notes for today's podcast. So if you're listening to this podcast with Clive and have enjoyed it, do me a favor, take a screenshot on your phone, share it to your Instagram stories. And it could be a way of sending something directly to someone that you think could do with a little bit of help, where they don't argue back and they can just listen to a podcast and share someone else's story. So don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. And finally, to wrap up, Clive, I want to say a huge thank you for your honesty and your openness and and willingness to sort of be vulnerable and share your story, because I know that will have a positive impact on people out there. You will never even get to know who they are, but it can be a turning point for people. And so it's like, in so many ways, your honesty and your life, for better or worse, is sometimes an example. And thanks for being a positive example today of your journey and how, what's that expression? Your past does not equal your future. So, Clive Allwright, thanks for being on this week's episode of the Grow My Salon Business podcast.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you'd like to connect with us, you'll find us at growmysalonbusiness.com or on Facebook and Instagram at growmysalonbusiness. And if you enjoyed tuning into our podcast, make sure that you subscribe, like, and share it with your friends. Until next time, this is Anthony Whitaker, wishing you continued success.